Hi, students. Today we're going to be looking at Period 4. And Period 4 is a very, very unique period because we have so much going on from the election of 1800 going all through Andrew Jackson, all these reforms that are happening, the market revolution. So this is really going to be kind of broken up really into like four parts, talking about the political, foreign policy, talking about the age of Andrew Jackson, talking about reforms and social movements, and then the last part being more of the economic market revolution of this. So I'm going to try to make this as brief as possible to try to give you this overview of everything. And like I said, you got to know the big things more than the small details when it comes to these AP tests. So where we left off from period 3 was this election of 1800, where we said that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are both trying to vie for the president of the United States. And we said that John Adams had passed a series of laws, the Alien and Sedition Act, in which case Virginia and Kentucky had filed resolutions in which they were going to nullify this law. By nullify, meaning to get rid of this law. Now, where this is going to come into play is when we get into Andrew Jackson. So just remember that we do have this nullification already happening between Kentucky and Virginia. Well, Thomas Jefferson wins the election. And when Thomas Jefferson wins the election, John Adams, who's a Federalist at this time, starts giving out last-minute court jobs or court appointments, federal court appointments, one of them being John Marshall, who's going to become now the Supreme Court Chief Justice. And he starts giving out a lot of different ones. One in particular does not get delivered to this individual on time, and his name is Marbury. So Marbury sues the United States. In this case, it's going to be and James Madison, who's going to be on the other side of this, in which case they are pleading this case. John Marshall pretty much says to Marbury, look, you were going for this, this law that you think you're entitled under the Judiciary Act of 1789, which we think is unconstitutional anyway. So you know what? Tough apples. You're not going to get on here. Even though that's how John Marshall got on to the Supreme Court, he's saying, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. So what really does happen with this one specific court case, and remember, John Marshall is a Federalist, it gives the Supreme Court the power of review, judicial review, to review court cases to whether or not they're going to be constitutional or not. Now, we call this time period of John Marshall the Marshall Court because what he does is that he strengthens the Supreme Court and the federal Supreme Court so much that they really start to gain a little bit more power to show supremacy over the states. Another example is going to be McCulloch versus Maryland, where the state of Maryland was trying to have a state tax on the national bank, or at least the Bank of the United States. And John Marshall said, no, federal government is supreme. You cannot tax a federal thing, but federal can tax state items. Now, there's going to be other things, other court cases. Gibbons versus Ogden, which was talking about interstate, regulating interstate trade, that the federal government should do that. You have Cohen's versus Virginia and Worcester versus Georgia. In each one of these cases, the same theme is going to be supreme federal courts. So you can see that even though Democratic Republicans are going to be controlling the presidency and, Congress, the federal court was dominated by federalism, at least this idea of federalism strengthening the Supreme Court, or strengthening national government over the state governments, which was opposite from Thomas Jefferson and his ideas of, states' rights. Now, getting into Jefferson, since we talked about now the Supreme Court, and we're going to be talking about two more specific Supreme Court cases when we get into more of the market revolution, is that these Barbary pirate wars that Jefferson engages in between 1801 to 1805, where the United States doesn't exactly win, and it all starts because Jefferson just refuses to pay tribute. but it puts the United States now on the world stage. Something else that's going on is the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, and the Louisiana Purchase doubles the United States territory overnight, in which they paid all they originally wanted was just rights to the port of New Orleans. And Napoleon, who's fighting against the British in these Napoleonic wars, says, you know what, I need all the money possible. Just take the whole entire thing, because Europe is more important to me than this land in the New World that we're not even worried about. So Thomas Jefferson had a constitutional dilemma, whether or not it was legal for him to purchase land, because it wasn't in the Constitution, and he was a very, very strict constitutionalist. So this one item really causes a big dilemma within the United States, in which they do, in fact, say, Jefferson says, you know what, we're going to do it anyway because this is such a good deal. And you have the Lewis and Clark expedition with Sacagawea, and they go and they explore all of this land and whatnot. So it's going to eventually start this idea of people moving out west. And we will get to that aspect when we get into the whole American system and market and the market revolution. But if we're talking about foreign policy in Jefferson, one of the bigger things that was happening is that England and France, because they're fighting each other, are also taking it out on the Americans, because the Americans are trying to trade with both of them. So there's Macon's Bill number 2, in which the United States declared, look, we want to remain neutral, but whichever country between the two says that they will trade with us, we will not trade with their enemy. In this case, France and England pick us, and then we won't trade to the other one. Other things that were going on is that England was starting to impress sailors, meaning that they were capturing sailors and taking them and putting them into the British Navy in order to fight Napoleon. Now, obviously, the Americans are going to be very upset with this, but you got to remember, most of these sailors that they're impressing or bringing back are British already. So all they were doing was just taking back the British sailors that were already British to put them into the British Navy. Now, all of this is going to eventually start the War of 1812. Before we get into the War of 1812, there is a Native American battle that the United States does win. It's called the Battle of Tippecanoe. It's William Henry Harrison with Tecumseh. And the big reason why is because Tecumseh is going to be a pro-British guy during the War of 1812. So it's kind of important to bring this aspect in, that Tecumseh is going to be, on the British side because of, these anti-American things out on the western frontier. So this War of 1812 pretty much starts, okay, and you have, these war hawks, these people that want to go to war really bad, just because it's, they think that it's going to help put America on the stage. We're talking about expansion. Henry Clay is one of your war hawks. A lot of people in New England don't want any parts of this because they're worried about the trade aspects of this. In fact, the War of 1812 was a very, very close vote. It was almost a 50% vote on whether or not to even go to war. It's one of the closest votes that Congress has ever had with regards to war. And all of these battles are going to be fought on the United States property or, territories and whatnot. So the United States, this is almost considered America's second war of independence against, England. In which case, the United States do successfully defend themselves pretty well. I mean, Washington, D.C. was burned, and then you have the Star-Spangled Banner in, Baltimore and whatnot, but the United States does successfully defend itself. So while this is going on, these Federalists are trying to come up in Hartford, Connecticut, with a brand new constitution, a revision to the Constitution, in which there were going to be some, good things in there. For example, the abolishment of the 3/5 compromise was going to be one of these ideas, this Hartford Convention. While that's happening, the Americans successfully create the Treaty of Ghent, which ends the War of 1812. But nothing is in there about the original issues between the United States and England that they were fighting over. So really, nothing happens in this war other than the United States has successfully defended themselves twice against England, and now no one's really going to be messing with them for quite some time, and it puts the United States now as a world power, at least respect-wise. And because this is so important, the Treaty of Ghent, now these Federalists are looked at as traitors. They're looked at as, no, you guys are not American. You're anti-American because you're coming up with this revision to the Constitution as we just won this war. So that kind of kills the Federalist Party. And another thing the War of 1812 does, it brings popularity to General Andrew Jackson, who wins the Battle of New Orleans after the Treaty of Ghent was already signed. Remember, there's no email, Twitter, Instagram, anything like that to actually give people, the heads up. But he wins that Battle of New Orleans and he gets popularity, and the Federalists are pretty much going to be gone. Okay, and this War of 1812 happens during James Madison's time, and by 1816, James Monroe, another Democratic Republican, is going to be elected, and this time period is going to be called the Era of Good Feelings. It was because there was no other political party at this time that was really rivaling. Everyone kind of was friendly. I always give a DBQ question on whether or not the Era of Good Feelings was actually really the Era of Good Feelings, and obviously we're going to kind of get into that. But James Monroe, if we're talking still about foreign policy, creates something called the Monroe Doctrine, and pretty much he's kind of telling Europe, get out of here, and if you try to come in here, we are going to fight you. So with that in mind, there's the Adams Ons Treaty, in which it's also known, or at least that's where Florida now gets purchased by the United States, and there's going to be other treaties and whatnot. But James Monroe's time, like we said, is a peaceful politically, even though it's not really. Okay, there's something called the Missouri Compromise in 1820 that's also going to happen, that's going to create sectionalism between the North and the South over this idea of slavery. Okay, they wanted to admit Missouri as a slave state. They would be causing an imbalance between North and South of slave states to free states. So in order to compromise this is Henry Clay now. Henry Clay is also known as the Great Compromiser, a Speaker of the House. He's going to run for president a few times, never wins. Okay, so they're going to make Maine a free state, Missouri a slave state, and everything that's south of the 3630 is going to be a slave state. Everything north of that's going to be a free state, and everyone's happy for now. It's just a band-aid, and that's going to really lead into your period 5, which is your sectionalism and leading up into the Civil War. And sectionalism, the main definition of it is pretty much regionalism. It's when you're more aligned to a specific region or state rather than declaring yourself as a American in this case. Okay, so in 1824, James Monroe is done. You now have an election between Andrew Jackson for the Democrat Republicans. You have John Quincy Adams, who's also in there. Henry Clay is also in there. Okay, so no one gets enough electoral votes. And when it doesn't go to enough electoral votes, you have to go into the House of Representatives. And Henry Clay realized he wasn't getting enough votes anyway, but he was Speaker of the House. So he makes a backdoor deal with John Quincy Adams in which he says, look, I can get you the president. I want to be Speaker of the House. And the reason why he wants to be Speaker of the House is because the past few presidents have become Speaker of the House and then jumped into this role of being president. John Quincy Adams says, you got it, deal. And when that happens, Andrew Jackson freaks out on this because Andrew Jackson had more popular votes. He had more electoral votes going into it. He just didn't have enough. John Quincy Adams becomes president, and there you go. Andrew Jackson now has a vengeance, because in 1828 he's going to go after John Quincy Adams. He's going to go crazy on him, and he will win this election, and it's going to create this age of Jacksonian democracy, which will be our second part of this whole entire unit or whole entire video. One of the first things that Andrew Jackson does is in 1828 is pass the Tariff of 1828, also known as the Tariff of Abominations. And the reason why it's called this is because of these tariff rates that are going to go up to an all-time high, which is going to disgruntle Europeans with wanting to trade with Americans. And the reason why this is so bad is that South Carolina starts freaking out over this because their cotton trade is going to be diminished. So John C. Calhoun, who was actually Andrew Jackson's vice president, leads this nullification crisis, saying he's not going to follow, or at least South Carolina is not going to follow this law. Now, I had told you earlier to connect the nullification crisis to, that's right, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. It's a connection between these two. And a lot of times, a lot of people consider the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions to be part of period 3, some people in period 4. It's kind of up to you on this. I still feel that that's kind of more period 3 because of the election of 1800, but, it's all good. Also, on top of all that, he tries to destroy the bank by moving money into the state banks. As you can see, Andrew Jackson is more of a states' rights individual compared to what then the Whigs that are going to come in. And the Whigs are going to be a brand new political group that's going to be forming. And Whigs are people who are against monarchs or kings, and they come from this English Civil War that happened in the 1600s. In this case, the Whigs are saying that Andrew Jackson is a king. He's a tyrant and he needs to be stopped. Now, we do have Whig presidents, okay, but we'll get into that in a few. Other things that Andrew Jackson is doing, and Andrew Jackson is just a very polarizing individual. He passes something called the Indian Removal Act, in which he removes the Cherokee Native Americans out of their land and pushes them west outside of the Mississippi River, in which is more famously known as this Trail of Tears. Okay, Andrew Jackson, as we said, he is not well liked in the history books just because of his dominance and viewpoints on what he was trying to do. And like I said, this is where the Whigs are going to come into this, as being this anti-Andrew Jackson group. And William Henry Harrison in 1840 is going to be one of these or at least running on the platform of anti-Andrew Jackson, and eventually Zachary Taylor would be too. So other things that are going on in this period 4 is the Second Great Awakening, moving now on into these social movements, because people were trying to become more spiritual, more religious, just more open to new things going into these 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. A brand new religion is starting called Mormonism, okay, where Joseph Smith and his followers, it's called the Church of Latter-day Saints these days. So these Mormons are being persecuted for their beliefs because back then they believed that, Jesus was it's just different from the Bible and whatnot. I'm not going to go into all the religious aspects of it. He is able to move into Ohio. Joseph Smith is then killed, and then Brigham Young brings the Mormons to Utah, in which is where, there's definitely a very high Mormon population in that area. Transcendentalism is going to be a big thing, and that's going to be more about socially trying to protest by not doing something. For example, I always give the students, if you wanted to protest a war in the way of a Henry David Thoreau, it's not that you would go out and protest or do something, you would just simply not do it. So if you don't like taxes, you don't pay your taxes. If you don't you don't want to join the war, you just burn your draft card, or you don't simply enlist into the military. Okay, and Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson are going to be your two main people for this. There's going to be more utopian societies, Brook Farm, New Haven, the Shakers, okay, places where people are trying to have everybody equal. This is also going to create a literature renaissance as well. And this is where you have Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And a lot of them are going to ask religious and existential questions about Puritanism, and it's simply more American literature. Even artwork is going to be changing with your Hudson River School that focuses on landscapes. Okay, there's going to be new romantic authors eventually, like The Last of the Mohicans is one of these new books. Other movements that are going on is going to be the abolitionist movement. You're going to have William Lloyd Garrison, who's going to be producing the anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator. You have David Walker, you have Frederick Douglass, all these abolitionists that are talking about freeing slaves and how slavery is wrong. In fact, your women's movement is even going to be connected into this as well. And speaking of women's movement, one of the major problems that's happening is this cult of domesticity, where women are pretty much being paid that they should be in the homes cooking, cleaning, and raising children, while other women now are trying to get women rights, specifically voting rights, property rights, divorce rights. And this is going to be very big during the Seneca Falls Convention, in which they're in 1848, which they're trying to bring about these new women's rights. Other reforms, public education with Horace Mann, where Horace Mann said that every single person in the United States should be able to get a free and public education, and should just not be the higher classes. There's going to be prison and mental institution reforms with Dorothea Dix. Another thing that's usually connected to the women's movement is the temperance movement. Temperance meaning not drinking. And the reason why women are usually connected to it is because men will go home and drink and then beat their wives and beat the children. Okay, so a lot of women then would also be connected into this women's movement. So there's a lot of different reforms during this period 4, and this is why period 4, is just so large when it comes to Jackson reforms and the foreign policy. And then the last aspect of this is going to be the market revolution. And finally, the market revolution. Okay, and before we kind of get into this market revolution, I want to bring up the last 2 court cases, Dartmouth versus Woodward and Fletcher versus Peck. Both of them, the Supreme Court said that contracts needed to be honored in both of those cases. So they're kind of bringing in this new idea of business, and that contracts should be upheld, even if they are bad deals and the public doesn't like them. They still need to be honored. So Henry Clay creates this new idea called the American system. And the American system was a way to try to expand out to the West and just try to build up the West so people would start moving out there. So other things that are going on at this case and that's creating business is that Eli Whitney is creating the cotton gin, which is helping out Southerners. Okay, you're now starting to have some steam power. The telegraph was being created between Washington and Baltimore, so now there's going to be easier ways to actually communicate with each other. So there are advances there. There's going to be new canal systems that are going to be built, brand new roads like the Erie Canal and then the Cumberland Road, the National Road, railroads with the B&O Railroad, Baltimore to Ohio Railroad. So there's going to be new ways for people to be able to move out west and settle out there. And while these factories are going to be started to be made, and you have the Lowell system and the Slater system, these 2 factories are now, women are starting to be working into there. You have old immigrants that are going into these new places also working into these factories. And by old immigrants, we're talking about Northwest Europeans, Irish and Germans. Okay, and when we get into more like period 6, you're going to see period 6 and period 7, you're going to see that there's something else called new immigrants. So just keep in mind, for right now, old immigrants of this period 4 time period, we're talking mostly about Germans and Irish coming into the United States. And a lot of the reasons why, if you know anything about European history, the easier one, the Irish potato famine, is really forcing a lot of Irish to come into the United States. And Germany is going through a lot of political strife. There's been a lot of revolutions, a lot of failed ones. They're not really going to unify until 1871 during the Franco-Prussian War, but I'm just giving you kind of like an update that's why a lot of Germans are kind of moving out of that area and coming into the United States. Something else that was going on was something called the putting out system, in which businesses would pay people to build a specific product at home and bring it in. Other people started having, the factory system within the actual factory, where you had to go to the factory and make it. Okay, so people started then to move out west. Things were kind of getting a little bit easier, and then you start having a split of sectionalism. in which you had, the West was getting rebuilt, or was getting built, not rebuilt, but getting built with railroads and canals that people were going out there and farming and getting new land. The North was getting stronger with commerce. And then the South, we don't really know what happens to them. It's not, we don't really know what happens, but nothing really is given to the South. So you can start to see, leading up into this Civil War, this sectionalism, that the South's like, well, what about us? What is the federal government doing for us, the central government, that is helping us out? Instead, they're focusing more on people in the North, people out in the West. And you're going to see when we get into the Civil War, it's really going to be a North and West versus the South. Now, earlier I had talked about the Missouri Compromise and everything. This idea, once again, is being brought up with this idea, or at least the ideals of sectionalism. So sectionalism is not only going to be just kind of a market revolution idea. You're going to see that economics is going to be playing a big part in the way that these two areas, or these two groups, are slowly going to be pulling themselves away. And it's going to be making sense because, at least in the North, you have the Whig Party that's really, focusing. Eventually it's going to be the Republican Party in the North. And in the South, you have the Democrats, in which they are, working for the small farmers, very similar to a Thomas Jefferson type. But now these Democrats are going to be Jacksonian Democrats. So this is going to lead into period 5, and period 5 is going to be about sectionalism, manifest destiny, Civil War. So it's going to be like Texas, slavery, James K. Polk, all of that stuff, the Mexican-American War. That's all going to be in period 5, and at least into the next video. But for now, thank you very much for listening through this very brief, even though period 4 is very complicated and very big and very long, and there's so many different aspects of it. Please subscribe so then you can get updates on the next one. You can go through the APUSH playlist if you're going to be taking Euro. I also have a Euro playlist as well of review videos. So thank you, keep on studying, and I hope you get a 5 on that test.